The gate behind me sealed shut with a hiss of pressurized air, and the heat hit me like a wall before I had even taken my first step. My name is Ethan Miles, and I was standing on a planet built to kill me within the hour. I did not know the exact numbers then, but I learned them later. 412 candidates from other worlds had walked through this same gate before me. 412 had died, some in minutes, some in days. None had ever finished the full 30. The air was thick enough to feel like breathing through a wet cloth. The ground beneath my boots was a strange reddish soil, cracked in places, steaming faintly where the sun struck it directly. Somewhere far off, something screamed, a long, rising cry that did not sound like any animal I had ever heard. I did not run. I did not freeze either. I simply stood still for exactly 10 seconds, turning my head slowly, taking in the shape of the land, the direction of the wind, the slope of the nearest hill. 10 seconds felt like a long time when every instinct in my body wanted to move immediately, but I had learned a long time ago that the first 10 seconds in a dangerous place decide whether you live through the next 10 hours. The ridge to my left was high ground. High ground meant a view. A view meant fewer surprises. I started walking toward it, keeping my steps light, watching the ground for tracks, watching the sky for shadows. Behind unseen cameras, somewhere far above the planet's thin clouds, a panel of alien examiners watched every move I made. I did not know their names yet. I did not know that one of them, a sharp-eyed observer named Kaylin Voss, was already leaning forward in her seat, frowning at a screen that refused to match anything in her records. The climb took 18 minutes. My legs burned by the end of it, the gravity here pulling harder than what I was used to, but I kept a steady pace instead of rushing, because rushing burns twice the energy and gives you half the awareness. At the top, I finally stopped and looked out over the land that was supposed to end me. It was beautiful in a brutal sort of way. Forests of tall black trees stretched across the valley below, broken by rivers that shimmered an odd silver color under the sun. Cliffs rose in the distance, jagged and sharp, and somewhere among them, I could just make out movement, something large, moving with a strange rolling gait. I dropped my pack and pulled out my gear, checking each item the way I always did, out of habit more than doubt. A blade, a length of strong cord, a small collection of tools built for cutting and starting fires, a water filter, a thin blanket that folded down to almost nothing. Everything the testers had allowed me to bring, and nothing more. That was the rule. No weapons capable of killing from a distance, no shields, no advanced technology, just skill, and whatever a person could build with their own two hands. I built my first shelter before the sun began to set, tucking it into a hollow beneath an outcrop of stone, where the wind could not reach directly, but where I still had a narrow view of the valley below. I gathered dry branches from the black trees, testing each one for the right kind of snap, before adding it to my pile. Fire mattered more than food on a night like this. Fire meant warmth, meant light to keep the crawling things away, meant a place for my mind to settle after a day that had already tried twice to end me. The first attempt came at dusk. A creature with too many legs and a low, flattened body slipped out from beneath a fallen log near my shelter, moving fast, faster than anything with that many joints should move. I heard it before I saw it, a dry clicking sound against the stone, and I was already on my feet with a burning branch in hand, before it broke from the shadows. It stopped the moment the light hit it. Whatever it was, it did not like fire, and it retreated back into the dark with an angry hiss that faded slowly into silence. I sat back down slowly, my heart beating fast but steady, and I let out a breath I had been holding without noticing. Fear was fine. Fear was useful. It kept my senses sharp, but I never let it decide what happened next. Above me, in a control room far beyond the clouds, Kaylin Voss made a note on her tablet. Candidate shows no panic response. Recommend closer observation. She did not know yet how much closer she would end up watching. By the third day, I had mapped a rough understanding of the valley. I knew which plants the smaller animals avoided, which told me which ones were likely poisonous. I knew the pattern of the wind, how it shifted twice daily, carrying scent one direction in the morning and the opposite by evening. I used that pattern carefully, always keeping my shelter downwind of open ground, so that anything hunting by smell would struggle to find me easily. The predators here were clever. but they were not patient in the way I was. I watched a pack of low, dog-sized hunters chase a smaller creature through the trees, only to lose interest the moment the chase became difficult. That told me something important. If I made myself difficult enough, most things here would rather look for easier prey. Not all of them, though. On the 5th day, I found tracks that made my stomach tighten. They were enormous, each print easily 3 times the length of my boot, pressed deep into the ground even though the soil here was hard and dry. Something heavy had walked through recently, and it had walked slowly, without fear, the way only the strongest thing in an area ever walks. I did not follow the tracks. I studied them from a distance, noting the direction, then quietly adjusted my route to avoid crossing its path directly. There is a kind of courage that looks like walking straight at danger, and there is another kind that looks like knowing exactly when not to. That night, the examiners watched a private argument break out among themselves, one that I would only learn about much later. A stern-voiced elder named Doran Ashworth insisted that I was simply lucky, that no creature with skin this soft and claws this useless could survive a death world through skill alone. Galen disagreed. She pulled up the tracking data and pointed out that in 5 days, I had adjusted my shelter location 4 times, always in response to changing wind or predator movement, never once by accident. Doran was not convinced, not yet. By the 7th day, the true test of the planet arrived, the one every previous candidate had failed to survive. The examiners called it the awakening, the moment when the largest apex predators on the planet began actively hunting instead of simply patrolling their territory. It happened on a cycle, roughly once every 8 days, and it explained why so few candidates had ever lasted even that long. I felt the shift before I understood it. The smaller animals disappeared entirely, the birds went silent, and the wind carried a new kind of stillness that felt wrong in a way I could not immediately explain. I had learned long ago to trust that feeling, the one that rises in your chest before your mind catches up to the reason. I found higher ground immediately and waited. It came an hour later, moving through the tree line with a heaviness that shook loose leaves from branches 30 feet away. It was massive, easily the size of a large truck, covered in thick plated skin the color of old iron, with a long, low skull built for crushing rather than biting. 4 legs, each thick as tree trunks, moved with a slow, deliberate power that made the ground tremble faintly beneath my boots, even from this distance. I did not move. I barely breathed. It passed close enough that I could see the scars along its side, old wounds from battles with other things just as large, and I understood immediately that fighting this creature directly would end in exactly one outcome, and it would not be mine. It caught my scent about 200 feet away. I saw its head lift, saw the massive nostrils flare, and I knew the moment had come to decide something quickly. I had already scouted a narrow passage between 2 rock formations 3 days earlier, a gap barely wide enough for a person to slip through, but far too tight for something this size to force its way through cleanly. I moved toward it immediately, not running in blind panic, but moving with purpose, the way you walk when you already know exactly where you are going. The beast let out a sound that rattled through my chest, a deep, grinding roar that seemed to come from somewhere far beneath its ribs, and it charged. I did not look back. Looking back costs time, and time was the only thing I could not afford to lose. I reached the gap between the rocks with barely 10 seconds to spare, slipping through sideways, feeling stones scrape against my shoulders as the creature's roar grew louder behind me. It hit the opening a moment later, and the entire rock formation shuddered under the impact. I kept moving forward, forcing myself through the narrow space even as dust and loose stone rained down around me, until I finally broke free on the other side into open air. Behind me, the creature struggled in the gap, its massive shoulders wedged too tightly to push through, its roars turning into frustrated grunts of effort. I did not stop to watch. I put 3 more ridges between myself and that sound before I finally allowed my legs to slow. When I built my fire that night, my hands were steady. My heart rate, according to the small monitor strapped to my wrist that fed data back to the examiners above, never rose past what a person might feel during a brisk walk. In the control room, Kaylin Voss stood up from her chair entirely, staring at the readout in disbelief. "He didn't kill it," she said quietly. "He didn't even try. He simply solved it, before it became something worth fighting. Doran Ashworth said nothing for a long moment. Then, finally, he made a note in his own file, one that Kaylin would later show me with something like pride in her voice. Recommend full re-evaluation of species threat assessment. The days that followed blurred together in a rhythm of careful movement and quiet observation. I built a second, sturdier shelter near a freshwater source, marking the safest paths to and from it with small piles of stone, simple enough that only I would recognize their meaning, useful enough that I never lost my way, even when storms rolled through and turned the sky the color of a fresh bruise. I learned to read the storms the same way I had learned to read the predators. The wind always shifted before the rain arrived, swinging hard from the east, carrying a sharp mineral smell that stung the back of my throat. I used that warning every time, retreating to shelter long before the first drops fell, while the storms themselves tore branches from trees and flooded low ground within minutes. Twice more, predators found my trail. Once, a pack of the dog-sized hunters cornered me near a river bend, moving with a coordinated pattern that told me they had done this before, successfully, against something smaller and slower than me. I used the river itself against them, wading into the shallows where their numbers meant nothing and their coordination fell apart, until they finally gave up and retreated into the tree line. The second time, a creature I never got a clear look at simply followed my scent for nearly a full day without ever showing itself, staying just far enough back that I could never confirm exactly what it was. I changed my route 4 times, doubled back twice, and crossed a shallow stream to break the scent trail entirely. By nightfall, whatever it was had lost interest, or lost the trail, and I never saw it again. Through it all, I never once forgot that this was still a test, that every choice I made was being recorded, studied, argued over by people I had never met, deciding whether an entire species deserved a place among the stars. That thought could have crushed me if I let it. Instead, I used it the same way I used everything else here, as information, not as pressure. By the 20th day, the examiners had stopped debating whether I would survive, and had started debating something else entirely. Kaylin brought forward a proposal that shocked even her own colleagues. She suggested that instead of simply certifying my species for trade rights, the coalition should study the specific methods I had used, not as an exception to be marveled at, but as a genuine framework worth teaching to future survival instructors. Doran, who only weeks earlier had dismissed the very idea that a soft-skinned, clawless species could last more than a few days, found himself unable to argue against the data in front of him. Instead, he asked a single question during their private session, one that Kaylin later repeated to me with something close to amazement in her voice. What if there are more like him? Down on the surface, I had no idea any of this was happening. I only knew the days blending into a rhythm, the growing familiarity of a place that had once seemed entirely alien to me. I knew the calls of the birds now, knew which ones meant danger, and which meant nothing at all. I knew the smell of rain before it fell, and the particular stillness that came before the largest predators began to move. On the 25th day, I faced my final true challenge, a flooding river that had risen far beyond its usual banks after 3 days of steady storms. My shelter sat dangerously close to the rising water, and I understood quickly that staying meant losing everything I had built. I moved before the water reached me, carrying what I could to higher ground, rebuilding quickly using skills I had sharpened over the previous weeks. The process took hours, exhausting hours of cutting, carrying, and stacking under a sky that refused to clear, but by the time the storm finally broke, I had a shelter standing strong on a ridge, well above the floodline, warm and dry despite everything the planet had thrown at me. I remember sitting by that fire afterward, looking out over a valley now transformed by flooding, silver water stretching, where there had once been solid ground, and feeling something unexpected settle over me. Not triumph exactly, something quieter than that. A simple, steady confidence that came from having faced nearly everything this world could offer, and having answered each challenge without losing myself to panic or recklessness. The final days passed almost gently by comparison. I continued my routines, gathering food, maintaining my shelter, watching the sky and the trees, with the same careful attention I had given from the very first hour. On the 30th day, exactly as the rules required, a small aircraft descended through the clouds, and landed in a clearing I had already prepared 3 days earlier, flattened and marked clearly enough for any pilot to find without difficulty. I walked toward it slowly, my pack over one shoulder, feeling the eyes of unseen cameras following my every step, for what I now understood would be the final time. Kaylin Voss was waiting when the aircraft door opened, standing there with an expression I could not immediately read. She studied me for a long moment before finally speaking through a small device that translated her words into something I could understand. "You were supposed to struggle," she said. I thought about that question for a moment, remembering the heat of that first hour, the roar of the creature trapped behind me in the stone passage, the quiet nights building fires that kept the dark at bay. I thought about fear, and how it had never once left me during those 30 days, and how it had never once been allowed to decide anything for me either. "Struggling is for places that surprise you," I told her. "This one just took a little getting used to." She did not respond right away. Instead, she turned and looked back at the planet behind us, the tall black trees, the distant cliffs, the silver rivers still swollen from the storm, and something in her expression shifted into what I can only describe as quiet respect. 11 days later, word reached me that my species had been granted full standing among the wider community of worlds, a decision made not through debate over ancient records or cautious diplomatic meetings, but through the simple, undeniable evidence of 30 days spent surviving a place built specifically to prove that survival was impossible. I still think about that planet sometimes, the heat of its air, the silver shimmer of its rivers, the deep grinding roar of a creature large enough to shake the ground beneath my feet. I think about the 10 seconds I spent standing still after that first gate closed behind me, watching, listening, deciding. I have come to believe that those 10 seconds mattered more than anything else I did in the following 30 days, because the difference between surviving and failing was never about strength, or speed, or sharp claws. It was about never letting a place surprise you long enough to control what you did next.